Hey, you ever get the feeling that what goes on in Congress is like some super complicated game with rules that maybe nobody fully understands?
Oh, definitely. Laws just seem to appear sometimes, right?
Yeah, and you're left scratching your head about how they actually made it through. Well, today we're going to try and, pull back the curtain a bit.
Make sense of one of those key moves.
Exactly. A process called budget reconciliation. We're especially looking at how it's being talked about for President Trump's big, beautiful bill.
Right. And it's interesting because this isn't the standard playbook for passing a law. Budget reconciliation is, well, you could call it a legislative shortcut, sort of.
A shortcut. How so?
It's a special process that lets major budget-related bills pass the Senate with just a simple majority, 51 votes.
Instead of the usual 60 you always hear about.
Exactly. It bypasses that filibuster threshold, but, and this is important, it comes with its own set of, let's say, complexities.
Okay, so it's a special tool, faster maybe, but you got to use it just right. And the idea here is to use it for Trump's big priorities.
That seems to be the plan. Things like border security funding, boosting defense, energy initiatives, and, of course, those significant tax policy changes.
Got it. So for our deep dive today, we really want to unpack how this budget reconciliation thing works. What are the steps, the potential roadblocks?
And what are the specific debates happening right now in Congress about this particular bill? That's what we'll get into.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. How does this process actually work? It sounds a bit like a maze.
It does have a few stages, yeah, but the very first one, this is critical.
Yeah.
Both the House and the Senate have to agree on the exact same budget resolution.
Identical.
Yep. Think of it like a master plan, like a financial blueprint. It sets the targets for spending changes, tells committees, you need to find cuts here, or maybe you have room to spend more there.
Okay, a blueprint. So once they agree on that, what's next? Do they just go off and do their own thing?
Sort of.
Mm.
Based on that blueprint, the different committees, energy, ways and means, armed services, all those, they start drafting the actual legal text.
The specific wording.
Right. To meet those budget goals they were given. They come up with their proposals, their recommendations, and send them over to their respective budget committees.
Okay, like different teams working on sections of a big project. Then what? Do they just staple it all together?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The budget committees take all those pieces and combine them into one massive bill. It's often called an omnibus bill.
Omnibus. Okay, like carrying everything.
Exactly. This huge package covering government spending across lots of different areas.
And then they vote on this giant thing. Is the process the same in the House and Senate?
Well, initially they can work on their own versions. The House might pass one, the Senate might work on its own. Often, though, lately the Senate kind of waits to see what the House does first.
Okay.
But if they do end up with different versions, they usually have to go to what's called a conference committee.
Ah, the negotiation room.
Pretty much. Members from both the House and Senate get together, try to iron out the differences, and hopefully create one single bill they can both pass.
Right, hammering out the final details. Now, you said earlier this gets around the 60-vote thing in the Senate. So what is the actual vote count needed?
Simple majority in both the House and the Senate. So in the Senate, assuming everyone's there, that's 51 votes.
51. That definitely sounds easier than 60, doesn't it?
It certainly lowers the threshold. But remember those complexities I mentioned?
Uh-oh. Yeah, you mentioned the Senate parliamentarian and something called the Byrd Rule. Sounds like a speed bump.
It can be a major one. The
Yeah.
Senate parliamentarian is kind of like the referee, the official rules interpreter.
Okay.
And they advise on Senate rules, including the Byrd Rule. Now, this rule is specific to budget reconciliation.
What's it do?
Basically, it says any provision, any part of that big omnibus bill has to have a direct and significant impact on the federal budget, on spending or revenues, money in, money out.
So you can't just slip in unrelated policy changes.
That's the idea. You can't use this shortcut for stuff that isn't really about the budget. The parliamentarian can look at parts of the bill and say, nope, this violates the Byrd Rule. And those parts can get stripped out.
Even if the whole bill has the 51 votes.
Even then. It's a check on the process to keep it focused on budget matters.
Ah, okay. Makes sense. So let's say the bill passes the House, passes the Senate with 51 votes, gets past the Byrd Rule hurdles. What's the absolute final step?
Same as any other bill, really. It goes to the president's desk to be signed into law.
Okay, that clarifies the process nicely. Thanks. Now let's shift to the current situation. What's the status of this specific bill, President Trump's big, beautiful bill, and what's the timeline look like?
Well, step one is actually done. Both the House and Senate managed to pass their budget resolutions before they went on their April recess,
So the blueprint is agreed upon, in theory.
in theory. Though, interestingly, in the House, there was a bit of drama, some pushback from the more fiscally conservative members, the fiscal hawks.
Oh, really? Worried about spending.
Yeah, they were concerned about the overall spending levels. It took some persuading,
Boy, Tate.
assurances, basically, promises that the Senate would aim for even deeper spending cuts than what the House initially proposed in that resolution. That seemed to bring enough of them on board to move forward.
Okay, so they got past that hurdle. What's next now that they're back from recess?
Now, the real work begins in the committees. They're starting what are called markups.
Markups.
That's where they actually write the detailed legal language for their part of the bill, aiming to hit those budget targets.
Got it. Is there a deadline?
There is. The committees are supposed to finish their work by May 9th. And the overall goal, which honestly sounds pretty ambitious,
Yeah.
is to get the final bill to President Trump's desk around Memorial Day.
Wow. That's fast for Congress, isn't it?
Very fast.
Hmm.
Reconciliation is designed to speed things up, but that's still a tight schedule.
Okay. Now, we mentioned spending increases and cuts. Can you give us a clearer picture? Where are they looking to spend more? Where are they cutting? You said the House and Senate have different ideas.
They really do. There are some pretty significant differences in their approaches. Let's break down the House first.
Okay.
For potential spending increases, the House resolution gives instructions to certain committees. Ways and Means, that's taxes mainly, could see an increase up to a huge $4.5 trillion.
$4.5 trillion. Wow.
Yeah. Then Judiciary, up to $110 billion. Armed Services, up to $100 billion. Homeland Security, up to $90 billion.
Those are big numbers. So to balance that, where are the House cuts coming from?
And this is where it gets really significant on the cut side. The targets are substantial. Energy and Commerce has the biggest job, find at least $880 billion in cuts.
$880 billion. That's massive.
It is. Then Education and Workforce, at least $330 billion. Agriculture, at least $230 billion. Oversight, at least $50 billion. And then smaller but still notable targets for transportation, financial services, natural resources, around $1 billion each minimum.
So if you add all those House cuts up,
You're looking at a minimum target of $1.5 trillion in total spending cuts in the House plan. For you listening, just grasp that scale, $1.5 trillion.
that is a really significant amount. Okay, how does the Senate compare? Same areas, different numbers.
Some overlap, but big differences in scale, especially on the cuts. For spending increases in the Senate, Finance Committee up to $1.5 trillion.
Okay, smaller than the House Ways and Means target, but still large.
Right. Then Judiciary up to $175 billion. Homeland Security also up to $175 billion. Armed Services up to $150 billion. Then smaller bumps for Commerce, Science and Transportation, and Environment and Public Works.
So similar themes like Judiciary and Armed Services, but different amounts. What about the cuts in the Senate? Are they aiming for that $1.5 trillion too?
And this is the really stark contrast. The Senate budget resolution sets much, much lower minimum cut targets for its committees.
Hello.
We're talking just at least $1 billion each for several key committees. Agriculture, banking, health, education, labor and pensions, HELP, and energy.
Just $1 billion each, minimum.
Yeah. So the total minimum cut target laid out in the Senate resolution is only around $4 billion.
A billion compared to the House's $1.5 trillion. That's a
Yeah.
gigantic difference.
It's huge. Now, it likely reflects different strategies, maybe different political realities in each chamber. And it's important to note,
Yeah.
the Senate probably expects to find more savings than just $4 billion. But setting those minimums so low compared to the House really highlights a massive gap they'll need to bridge later on.
Definitely seems like a major point they'll have to negotiate. Now, something else that jumped out was this whole debate about current policy versus current law accounting. You mentioned a $3.8 trillion difference. What's that about? Sounds technical.
It is a bit technical, but it's really important. It's basically about how they count the cost of extending the Trump tax cuts, which are set to expire.
Okay.
The Senate's plan uses this current policy baseline. The idea is if a policy is already happening, like the tax cuts are now, then just continuing it doesn't count as a new cost in the budget projections.
So extending them looks like it costs nothing, even though we know it reduces government revenue by, what, $3.8 trillion?
Exactly. Under that accounting method, it scores as zero cost against the budget resolution targets. It makes a very expensive policy look free on paper.
Huh. And the House?
The House is using the more traditional current law baseline. This way treats renewing expiring policies like tax cuts as new legislation with a real budget impact.
So they are accounting for the cost.
Yes, the resolution includes that huge $4.5 trillion allocation for Ways and Means, largely to cover the cost of extending those tax cuts, because under current law, it does have a cost.
So the choice of accounting method drastically changes how things look. Could this cause problems?
It certainly could. This difference could absolutely be challenged. It might even go to the Senate parliamentarian to rule on which baseline is appropriate under the reconciliation rules.
Did they get a ruling beforehand?
No. Interestingly, Senate Republicans decided to move ahead with their resolution using current policy without getting the parliamentarians' okay first. They argued the Budget Committee chair had the authority. So that's definitely a space to watch.
Yeah, sounds like a potential flashpoint. Okay, another really big issue that's come up, Medicaid. There are warnings the House plan could lead to cuts there. What's the story?
This is obviously a huge concern for many people. Critics of the House plan quickly raised alarms about potential cuts to Medicaid, the healthcare program for millions of lower-income Americans, children, and people with disabilities.
And is there evidence for that?
Well, an analysis from the CBO, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, seemed to back up those concerns. The CBO looked at the House's big spending cut targets.
Right, that $1.5 trillion total.
Exactly. And they found that hitting those targets, especially the massive $880 billion cut assigned to the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Which oversees Medicaid.
Precisely. Hitting that target would likely require significant reductions in Medicaid spending.
Why specifically Medicaid?
Because the CBO analysis, prompted by some Democratic members, looked at all the mandatory spending under that committee's control, excluding Medicare, which GOP leaders say they won't cut.
Okay.
And they found Medicaid makes up something like 93% of all the remaining mandatory spending in that committee's jurisdiction. Mandatory spending being stuff required by law, like benefit programs.
So if you have to cut $880 billion from that pot, and 93% of the pot is Medicaid, it seems almost unavoidable, right?
That's the conclusion many drew from the CBO analysis. Now, Republican leaders haven't explicitly said we're cutting Medicaid benefits. They talk about removing fraud, waste, and abuse, maybe adding work requirements, which could reduce enrollment.
But Democrats aren't buying that.
Not really. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries basically said, look at the math. With targets that big for that committee, they're likely going after Medicaid. So yeah, it's a very sensitive, very controversial part of the plan with potentially huge real-world impacts.
Definitely sounds like it. Just to give us some perspective, is this budget reconciliation process like a new thing, or has it been used before?
Oh, not new at all. It's been around since 1980. And it's been used quite a bit, nearly 2 dozen times, actually, by both parties.
Really? Can you give examples?
Sure. Democrats used it under President Biden for the big pandemic relief package, the American Rescue Plan, and also for the Inflation Reduction Act.
Okay. And Republicans?
Republicans used it under President Trump to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017, those same tax cuts we were just talking about.
So it's a known tool in the toolbox for both sides when they control Congress and the White House.
Exactly. It's seen as a way to enact major priorities without needing cooperation from the minority party in the Senate.
You also mentioned a time it didn't work for Republicans.
That's right. Also, during Trump's first term, they tried to use reconciliation to repeal major parts of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Those efforts failed. They couldn't get the 51 votes in the Senate, even using reconciliation. So it's a powerful tool, but it's not magic. It doesn't guarantee success. Politics and internal party agreements still matter a lot.
That's a really important point. Even with the shortcut, it can still fall apart. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What are the key things we should take away from this deep dive today?
I think the main thing for you to remember is that budget reconciliation is this specific, fast-track legislative process. It has unique rules, like the Byrd Rule, and its main advantage is letting certain budget bills pass the Senate with just 51 votes.
And Republicans are trying to use this tool right now for President Trump's agenda spending, taxes, border security.
Correct, but it's not smooth sailing. There are major debates happening, especially over how deep the spending cuts should be, and real concerns about the potential impact on programs like Medicaid.
And those big differences between the House and Senate plans, particularly on the size of the cuts, and that whole accounting issue for tax cuts, those are huge gaps they need to close, right?
Absolutely. Reconciling the House and Senate positions is going to be a major challenge. The process is complex, the stakes are high, and the path forward for this big, beautiful bill is likely to be, well, pretty bumpy.
So, for you, the listener, as you watch this unfold, maybe think about how these big budget choices could ripple out. How might they affect programs or sectors you care about, maybe even in your own community?
Yeah, and consider those different accounting methods. How does framing the cost of something like tax cuts change the debate? It's not just about the numbers, it's about the story those numbers tell.
It really prompts you to think, doesn't it? How do these big Washington decisions actually shape government priorities and ultimately our daily lives?
It definitely encourages digging a bit deeper than the headlines, maybe seeing how proposed changes might play out locally.
Absolutely. And if you found this deep dive helpful, if you want to keep making sense of these kinds of complex issues that shape our world, please do subscribe to The Deep Dive.
We try to break down complicated stuff like this regularly.
We do. So hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and you won't miss our next exploration. Thanks for tuning in.